Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the only class that answers the question, the only one in the world that answers the question, what will Rabbi Wolpe say at his Thursday morning Torah class? Nowhere else can you find the answer to that. Now, you might not want the answer to that, but it is nonetheless true that this is the only class that answers it. So I'm glad you're here. This morning, we finally got out of the double Parsha bind, even though next week we have a double Parsha again. But this week we don't. This week we just have Emor. And Emor, which is, depending on your interests, can be seen as an extremely interesting Parsha, but is not filled with everything that enchants everyone. Emor is largely concerned with the priests and the responsibilities of the priests and the actions of the priests, which we're not going to spend too much time. Don't worry. And what they have to do in order to carry out God's will as the superintendents of the religious life of Israel, and that's essentially what they were. So I want to spend, first of all, a minute to talk about the difference between the priests and the prophets. You may or may not know that this was a very famous essay in its time by Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am, the great Zionist thinker and philosopher, wrote an essay called The Priest and the Prophet. And he talked about the fact that both were necessary for religious life. Coffee, which is also necessary for religious life. And it's because the prophet is the great innovator, the one that brings the ethical charge, the vision, and so of that, and all of that to Israel. And the priest is the one who brings regularity, being anchored, ritual, stability, repetition, the feeling of I'm safe here. And yet, without the other, religion either flies off into a world that can't be sustained. I mean, Solomon Schechter had a beautiful line about this. He said, prophetic religion is like living on oxygen alone, right? You can't always breathe that rarefied air. You can't entirely live with a prophetic vision. And yet without the prophetic vision, if you only have the priestly vision, religion becomes rote and routine and dull and does not enact the kind of change in society and in the world that is part of religion's mandate, right? Which is l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to make the world better under the kingdom of the Almighty. So when we read about the priests here, it is important to remember that this is an indispensable part of the religious balance that is in Judaism and in other religions as well, in different ways, in order to enable the tradition to do what it does, both for individuals and also for society. And remember that because Judaism was creating a society, it wasn't just creating a synagogue, but it was creating a society. So it had to also have the civil laws about who was allowed to get married and who was allowed to be together and who was not allowed to be together, and prohibitions on things like incest, and those kinds of things were also folded into the priestly legislation, and at least juxtaposed to the priestly legislation. And so the entire parsha of Emor puts all of these kinds of themes in one place, and they fall under the larger rubric of purity. Purity being not exactly co-equal with morality. To be moral is one thing, but purity is something else. Purity is a a sort of metaphysical designation. It's something that is about holiness and sanctity and not solely about ethics. And so, for example, the Av Tumah, the primary source of purity, is a dead body. Now, why would that be? According to several sources, it's because it is pure physicality with the life out of it. And so it is the life that creates the sense of purity and possibility and so on. Whereas a corpse might make you think that the world was just material, just lifeless, just what it is. And the Av Tumah being death, that is death, which is in some ways the great antagonist of religious life, because it's what puts an end to religious life, at least in this world, brings us to another great theme that I do want to talk about with a little bit more length of this parsha. And that is, we're right now in the time of the Omer. The Omer begins the second night of Pesach, and it is a counting. You count the Omer. The word Omer means sheaf because this corresponds to the barley harvest, the 49 days. It's 7 weeks of 7 days between the second night of Passover and Shavuot. Shavuot being the holiday where we celebrate receiving the Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So what you have is a holiday that has three separate significances. It has, first of all, the journey from Egypt, that is Passover, to Sinai, Shavuot. It has a significance agriculturally, so it's historically and agriculturally. Agriculturally because of the barley harvest, and then metaphysically as well. There are along the way various exercises, meditations, especially the Kabbalists have, to help people grow their souls in the Omer. But the general cast of the Omer is one of mourning, is one of sadness. And the traditional reason given is that the students of Rabbi Akiva suffered from a plague during the time of the Omer, and many died. And the plague ceased on Lag BaOmer, which is a festival. But a lot of people think that that's probably a sort of an attempt to hide the real source of mourning during the Omer, because remember that Rabbi Akiva's students, when they talk about their being died, Rabbi Akiva died during the revolt against the Romans, the revolt against the Romans, followed by the Hadrianic persecutions in 132 to 135. And therefore, it might be that this was a time of particularly intense persecution, but they couldn't say that out loud because they were still under the heel of the Romans. So they said there was a plague and many of the students died. We don't know exactly what happened, but it is interesting to note that there is this sense of mourning, and in some ways it fits what happens after liberation, because the exhilaration of liberation gives way to fear and uncertainty and trepidation and even panic. It's one of the reasons why you get the golden calf, because the Israelites are liberated. There's this exaltation at the sea, and then all of a sudden it's like, now what? Here we are in the desert, and we have to figure out how to make our way without any of the structures that we have been used to for the hundreds of years that we were slaves in Egypt. And so the Omer does have this sense not only of sadness, but of uncertainty. And I wanted in particular to focus on something that I focused on in my column for the Jerusalem Post this week, which was about the idea that the Omer is leading you. The Omer is a unit of time, right? You leave Egypt, you get to the Sinai. You finish Passover, you get to Shavuot. It's a unit of time, 49 days, the 50th day of Shavuot. But it's a unit of time that leads to a place. It leads to Sinai. And the interplay of space and time is very deep in the Jewish tradition. The word olam means forever, but it also means the world, space and time being similar in the way we conceive of them both being indispensable, not similar, but indispensable in the way we conceive of the world. And in the Bible, in the Torah, the word that ties the two together is moed, because the place where the priests meet God is called the Ohel Moed, the tent of Moed, the tent of meeting. And not only is there a tent of meeting for the priests, there's a tent of meeting for the Israelites that's mentioned in Exodus, where God tells Moses, set up this tent of meeting, and those Israelites that wish to come and meet me can do it in the Ohel Moed. So Moed means a space. It is a place, a secure place, an important place where you go to offer sacrifices to meet God. But in Emor, the other theme, apart from the priests, is Emor talks about the Chagim, the holidays. We have the details of Sukkot in Emor, for example. And it calls them Moadim. So it's the same word, Moed, Moadim. Moadim is the plural. So the question is, how is it that Moed can be both space, because the Moadim happen, the Ohel Moed is a particular place, it's a particular location. The tent of meeting is the tent of meeting, but it's also a time, because a Moed, a holiday, is a time, it's not a space, right? We celebrate Shavuot in a couple of weeks. It's a space, place. It's a time, rather. I keep getting confused. It's a time, it's not a place. And the essential difference, of course, is between space and time for human beings, without getting too metaphysical, is you can revisit a place. You can't revisit a time. You can remember it, but you can't revisit it. I can't revisit 10 minutes ago, but I can sit in the same place that I was 10 minutes ago, because place is repeatable. Time is not repeatable. And when the tradition ties together place and time, what is it trying to teach us? So part of it is that we create times that are somewhat revisitable. That's why Heschel calls the Shabbat a cathedral or a sanctuary in time, because it's a place you can go and sort of revisit the same time that you had Shabbat last week and the week before, even though obviously it's not the same time. But it's a sanctuary in time because it feels like time for a moment is suspended and you're in Shabbat just like you were last week and the week before and the year before and the years before, okay? And so the attempt of the tradition is to create this sort of nexus of time and space. And that's one of the reasons why the Israelites, finally, when they came to Sinai, began for a moment at least to settle down after the golden calf, because they had a place. Now, then they went encamping place to place to place to place to place. But when somebody is sad, when somebody is distressed, when somebody is in mourning, they need a place to be. And that's why the traditional formula to a mourner is Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'toch Sha'ar Evelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim. May God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. But when you say may God comfort you, you say Hamakom. And Hamakom in Hebrew means the place. So you're literally saying, may the place comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Now, we call God the place, according to the Talmud, because the world is God's place, although God vastly transcends the world. But you understand the idea, which is, for the moment, God is acting like a place, an anchor, something that you can hold on to, something that will feel like I can rest here because I'm in such distress and such anguish and such pain. And all of this goes back to the moed of the holidays and the tent of meeting. And this part of it, to return to the theme that we started with at the beginning, this part of religious tradition is the priestly part. It's the feeling that people get when they go into the sanctuary now. Now we're just beginning to return to the synagogue. And when people go back, they feel like, this is the place, right? In synagogue, there's something called makom kavua, a fixed place. You know how some people sit in the same seat over and over and over and over and over, and they get very upset if they have to sit in a different seat, because there's something essentially comforting about the place. When you walk into your house, it feels different from walking into someone else's house. It just almost like the air smells different. Everything about it's like your house. When you're home, I'm home. This is the place. And the place itself contributes to the spiritual restfulness, the spiritual possibility of being calmed and comforted, especially when one is in mourning. And so there are a lot of really fascinating themes that Amor brings up. The Omer, the holidays, the Ohel Moed, the distinction between priest and prophet, the question of mourning and what that means. All of these are in this week's Parsha, and I'm happy now to take questions or comments if anybody has questions or comments about some of the themes that we have been talking about. And please fire away, either on the Facebook or in the YouTube chat. Let me know while I take a sip of coffee. Okay. So let me address 2 or 3 different questions. First is the end of the priesthood. When the temple was destroyed, the priesthood continued but didn't continue. That's why you have still people who are Kohanim. And the idea is that the Kohen should keep their purity. That's why Kohanim still are not supposed to go into a graveyard, although they can violate that for their immediate family, which, by the way, is something that's given in this Parsha, that they can violate that for their immediate family. But the reason that the Kohanim don't go into a graveyard is because you're supposed to keep the purity in case the temple is restored, so that you as a Kohen are ready to serve. That's one. The second part of this is that the regulations for being a Kohen, they're not secret. Like everything, it's not that like Kohanim are passing on to other Kohanim this secret knowledge that only Kohanim get to have. That doesn't work that way. Everything in the Torah is in the Torah. Anyone can read it. You can read what the priests are supposed to do as easily as the Kohen Gadol, as the high priest. So it's a service to God, and you have to train in it, but it's not a secret service. And yet it is also true. I don't want to make any bones about this, that there is a hierarchy of Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, of the Kohen, the Levite, and the Israelite in the Jewish tradition. Not that one is better, but they do have different tasks. It is a practice for some people, by the way, during the Omer, because I was asked not to shave, not to do weddings, not to have celebrations. And there are all sorts of calibrations of different degrees of observance of this. Some people do this up to Lag BaOmer, and after Lag BaOmer, they have weddings and parties and so on. For some, it's to observe the mourning. For some, it's honestly somewhat superstitious. Generally, I think in the conservative movement, people do shave. Most people don't grow sphira beards, as they're called. Sphira is another word for Omer. Sphirata Omer is the full term. It's the counting of the Omer. And we, at least, along with many other people, do weddings, especially after Lag BaOmer, when even if you observe the morning before the Omer, that morning is reduced. I'm not sure that I understand the question about how we understand this in the context of the pogroms, the diaspora, and the current housing crisis. I'm not sure I get that. What the question is there a tension between prophet and priest in something versus Ezra Nehemiah Chronicles? I don't know what that first word is, Dist. And then why am I so hopeful during the Omer? Sandy asked. The spiritual elements of the Omer are inspiring, and it shouldn't be during a time of mourning. So the only thing I would say is that, in fact, the truth is that the period of mourning for a lot of people in general is a period of great inspiration and depth. So I think that that's not unusual, and especially if it's a fixed period of mourning that's not about an individual loss, it can give you hope, because yes, you always think that there's a possibility when you come out of this period of mourning that things will be better. Jim mentions the dichotomy between Heraclitus's maxim that you can't step in the river twice and sameness, which is Thales, by the way. Everything is water. So it's Thales versus Heraclitus, that everything changes and everything's the same. And also Ecclesiastes, that both are true, right? The sun rises, the sun sets, and it goes back to where it rises again. So things look like they're changing, but they're really the same. He says every now and then there'll be a phenomenon in which people say it's new. Believe me, it happened long before. And it depends how deeply you look into the structures of society, whether you find the sameness or you don't find the sameness, because in some ways things are obviously different from what they used to be, and nothing is exactly the same. But it is nonetheless true that human beings seem to go into certain same recurring patterns in terms of their behavior, both as individuals and also as groups and as nations. So I guess partly it depends how far back you pull the lens. I mean, just think about this. Think about the camera as it goes back and back and back from the Earth, right? Things that look extremely different as you go further from the Earth, they start to look the same. And so I think the level of generalization in part determines whether that's true or not. And if you look back through history, I think you'll find, one of the reasons why we study the Torah is because we find that the lessons that it derives from the Israelites thousands of years ago are not so dissimilar from the lessons that we need to derive from the Israelites today and from everybody else today, for that matter. So Deuteronomic history versus Chronicles, specifically the role and authority of the priests. So this is the Deuteronomic history is a particular, this is a much longer discussion, but there are thought of as four different strands that called JEPD that lead into that together combine to form the Torah text. The priestly evaluation of the priests and the Deuteronomic evaluation of the priests are different, because the Deuteronomic historian was primarily concerned with royalty and not with the priesthood, was concerned with the ruling house, with David in particular, and the history that led up to David. And so there is this tension, which is true, between and this is unsurprising because you saw this tension even in the Middle Ages between king and the church in Christendom. Just go see the movie Becket, and you'll see that there was always this tension between those who held religious power and those who held civic and state power. And so there's a tension between Samuel and Saul, for example, where Samuel strips the kingdom from Saul. And for the Deuteronomic historian, the priesthood is not the primary concern. The primary concern is the succession of kings that will end up in the Messiah, who in some ways unites both, right? The Messiah unites both the governmental and the religious, not religious is not exactly the right term, but let's say the priestly wings, by being the spiritual and military deliverer, because remember that the Messiah was supposed to be a military hero. The idea of being a place being important to one's experience of the holy and of being of comfort, as we cannot revisit a time. How do we understand that in the context of the diaspora and even the current housing crisis? Got it. Okay, now I understand what you were saying. So what I would say is that when you talk about the current housing crisis, I mean, that's a big part of it. People who don't have a place feel insecure in the world. I mean, even the people who set up on the VA, who set up tents, as awful as it is to see people, especially people who served our country, living in tents, they need a place. This is my tent. They'll decorate the tent, or they'll put a flag up on the tent. Why? Because everybody needs to feel like this is my place. It belongs to me. It expresses who I am. It's where I feel myself as safe as I can feel myself in this. So, yeah, I think the wandering of the Jews is part of what created this tremendous deep insecurity. And the return to Israel was the return to a place that was ours. And one of the reasons why throughout Jewish history, Jews were so patriotic to the countries they were in, by and large, depending on the country, but it's certainly true in Germany. It was true in Russia for some, depending, is because you need a place. You have to have a place. Jerry asked a really interesting question, which is whether the Jewish approach to dead bodies is a reaction to the extreme Egyptian reverence for the dead. And that could have played into it. It is certainly possible, and it's an interesting speculation. For Jews, dead bodies are bodies, and they're treated with respect because they once housed a human being, but they're not objects of reverence, and we don't mummify them and don't preserve them. It's from dust to dust. So that is an interesting speculation. I like that. And tonight, for those of you who are interested, on Clubhouse Torah at 6 o'clock, I'm going to be talking about masculinity, toxic and good in the context of the Torah. So if that is a subject that interests you, 6 o'clock on Clubhouse, masculinity. And until then, I hope you have a good Thursday. And now you know the answer to the question that I posed at the beginning, which is, what are we going to talk about in Thursday Morning Torah?